broke on January the 23rd, 1881. The mercury had plummeted to 44 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The gale shrieked with a rage that felt as if it had escaped from a frozen underworld. Across Lawrence County, within the Dakota Territory, timber cabins groaned like fractured bones. Plumes of smoke seeped through poorly corked window frames. Entire households huddled tightly around ravenous hearths that consumed firewood, while offering barely any warmth in return. Yet there was one particular dwelling that stood apart. It was tiny, unassuming, practically swallowed by the snow-draped hills. Not a single wisp of smoke drifted from this structure. No lantern's glow flickered through its glass panes. The nearest settlers, those still capable of wading through waist-deep drifts, murmured that the widow had perished. They assumed her madness had finally caught up with her. They believed her stubborn pride had turned her into a solid block of ice. However, once the daylight managed to pierce the overcast sky and someone gathered the courage to knock on her door, death wasn't what awaited them. It was life. They were greeted by a gentle, steady, utterly baffling warmth. They found a 57-year-old woman resting by a table, calmly knitting a woolen sweater. There was no blazing hearth, no logs turning to ash. Despite that, the air inside her home was a full 54 degrees warmer than the brutal cold outdoors. How could this be? What mystery was hidden within those walls that everyone else had dismissed as utter garbage? To make sense of this tale, we have to go back 3 years in time, to the autumn season of 1877. That was when a woman by the name of Ingrid Sorensen arrived in South Dakota, carrying nothing but $18 to her name, a battered leather valise, and the heavy burden of recent widowhood. Ingrid hailed from Norway. She grew up in a village where the freezing season dragged on for 8 months, and the sun barely made an appearance. She had sailed across the Atlantic alongside her husband, chasing the dream of a promised land, a place where rumor had it that even penniless folks could claim a patch of soil for themselves. But fate rarely shows mercy to those who dream. Her beloved Lars succumbed to pneumonia before he could ever see that vision become a reality. A nasty chill morphed into a raging fever. He suffered through 3 agonizing days. And then there was only silence. Ingrid was left completely alone. No children to comfort her, no relatives nearby. She was also at an age that most folks deemed far too old to be starting from scratch. Ladies from her era were generally expected to find a new husband, seeking shelter and security beneath another man's roof. Yet Ingrid was cut from a different cloth. Her father had made his living raising farmhouses in the rugged Norwegian peaks. Her grandfather was the sort of quiet fellow who knew how to decipher the whispers of the wind and the soil, and she had been taught how to pay attention to those very same things. Upon walking into the Deadwood Land office, the clerk eyed her with deep pity. He suggested a plot close to the settlement, modest in size but easy to reach. Ingrid turned the offer down. She requested a spot further out, a cheaper parcel, a tract of land that nobody else desired. They granted her 100 acres situated on a ridge completely battered by the northern gales. It was a piece of wilderness that no rational pioneer had ever bothered to stake a claim on. $18. That was the entire price she paid to secure her destiny. Her initial days were an exercise in raw survival. Ingrid rested in a borrowed wagon. Her meals consisted of stale crusts and water drawn from a nearby creek. She paced across her acreage repeatedly, taking everything in. She felt the dirt. She gauged the prevailing breezes. She was hunting for the precise spot where her grandfather would have laid a foundation. Eventually, she stumbled upon a slight natural hollow in the hillside. It felt like a location where the landscape itself was opening up for an embrace. Right there, she started to shovel. She wasn't building a residence on top of the soil, but rather a shelter integrated into it. It was half submerged. The facade faced due south to harvest every single beam of winter sunlight. When the earliest passers-by spotted her laboring, they pulled their horses to a halt just to watch. Ingrid stood all by herself, wielding a spade, shifting dirt with the vigor of a youthful laborer. One of those onlookers was a fellow named Thomas Whitmore. He was the proud owner of 750 acres. He had a 2-story home. He brought in livestock from out east. His garments were impeccably clean at all times. Thomas dismounted his steed, wearing the patronizing smirk typical of men who are always used to being right. "Mrs. Sorensen," he boomed, ensuring the pair of companions riding with him could hear every word. "Are you digging your own grave out here, or do you intend to live like a badger?" The other men chuckled. One of them was Jacob Brenner, a long-bearded German immigrant who had spent 2 decades surviving the Dakota plains. He considered himself an expert builder. He was fiercely proud of his craftsmanship. The third was Samuel Perkins, a deeply pious man who possessed a worn-out Bible and very strict views on how widows ought to conduct themselves. Ingrid didn't even bother to look up. She just kept on shoveling. "A proper Christian lady ought to seek the charity of her congregation," Samuel stated in a righteous tone. "It isn't dignified for you to toil like a beast of burden." And without proper lumber, lacking glass panes, and missing a sturdy stone hearth, Jacob chimed in while shaking his head. "That shack won't survive a single winter. I've seen some shoddy framing in my day, but this is pure suicide." Thomas stepped a bit closer. "Ma'am, I am willing to make you a generous proposition. You could come work at my estate. Cooking, keeping the place tidy. I'll hand you $4 every month, and you'll get a heated room. There's no need to work yourself to death out here." At last, Ingrid paused her digging. She wiped the perspiration from her brow using the back of her glove. She stared down the 3 gentlemen with those piercing blue eyes that had gazed upon the treacherous Atlantic without a hint of fear. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen," she replied, her thick accent rolling her R's heavily. "But my grandfather raised timber homes in Norway that have stood tall for 2 centuries. I learned my trade from him. Furthermore, my husband did not pass away just so I could become someone else's maid." The 3 men exchanged quick glances. It was that specific blend of pity and scorn, usually reserved for folks they deem foolish yet harmless. Thomas simply shrugged his shoulders. "Pride is a deadly sin, ma'am," Samuel muttered as they turned their mounts away, "and the winters around these parts show no mercy to the proud." However, Ingrid wasn't operating out of vanity. She was relying on wisdom, because a very specific image was etched into her memory. She recalled her grandfather during a snowy evening back in Norway, pointing out the walls of an ancient barn to her. They were incredibly thick walls, not crafted from masonry, not fashioned from expensive timber. They were built out of densely compacted straw. It was straw bound with mud, a material that trapped pockets of air and transformed the freezing chill into a cozy refuge. "The trick isn't simply burning more logs," her grandfather had told her in a deep, serious tone. "The real trick is ensuring the warmth never escapes. A thick barrier of straw is worth more than all the king's gold." With that firmly in mind, she began her task. For 6 grueling weeks, Ingrid labored from the crack of dawn until her calloused hands could no longer grip her tools. First, she framed the rudimentary skeleton of the house. Cheap wooden posts, slender support beams, absolutely nothing fancy. Then came the phase that would turn her into the laughingstock of the entire county. She gathered every single scrap of straw she could get her hands on, leftover stalks from the autumn harvest, refuse that the local farmers usually torched or left to rot in the fields. Bales they gladly handed over while snickering behind her back. "Take as much as you'd like, ma'am," they would tell her. "If you're really fixing to build a house out of straw, at least you'll give us a mighty fine tale to tell around the stove this winter." Ingrid hauled the bales in a rickety cart pulled by an aging donkey she had acquired for a mere $3. Trip after exhaustive trip. Massive heaps of golden stalks. She then started to pack the empty cavities between her wooden uprights. She didn't just toss it in loosely. She compressed it. She rammed it down with tremendous force. She forged dense, rigid blocks that absolutely refused to let the drafts penetrate. The structure's walls slowly rose. Thick, incredibly thick, measuring nearly 2 feet in depth. By the time she finished framing, the cabin resembled a bizarre, lumpy mound against the prairie horizon. The windows were tiny. The entryway was unusually low. Yet, every single inch had been calculated with purpose. Following that, she mixed thick mud with extra stalks and plastered the entire exterior. It served as a resilient shield to ward off the driving rain and heavy snowfall. Finally, she capped it with a low, nearly flat roof, shingled with reclaimed timber from a derelict shed. The final expense was laughably small by the standards of that era. Just $12. That sum even accounted for the lumber, the stubborn donkey, a few second-hand tools, and her iron nails. While Ingrid was putting the finishing touches on her eccentric shelter, her neighbors were erecting their proper, respectable residences. Thomas Whitmore had a crew of carpenters hammering away at his grand estate. He used pine boards shipped from afar, genuine glass windows, a towering hearth made of fired red brick. The tally had ballooned well past $500, a figure he boasted about freely. A homestead mirrors the true worth of the gentleman residing within it, he would proclaim to anyone listening. Jacob Brenner built his place following strict German traditions. Sturdy walls fashioned from massive logs, carefully chinked using moss and clay. Immovable, dependable. The exact same methods his father had sworn by. He poured a solid $300 into the venture. Samuel Perkins decided on a timber-framed house featuring an expansive parlor meant for hosting prayer meetings. He drained his life savings to do it. $250. Every plank was nailed down with religious fervor. When Ingrid finally sparked her very first blaze inside her cabin's modest stove right around mid-October, something truly remarkable occurred. The warmth didn't flee. It lingered. It built up inside those heavy, straw-packed barriers. And when she allowed the embers to die out overnight, the indoor climate dropped by scarcely a couple of degrees. The underlying physics were straightforward, yet incredibly potent. Dried stalks hold millions of microscopic air pockets. Stagnant air is a terribly poor conductor of thermal energy. Therefore, whenever the heat tried to bleed out into the freezing wilderness, it had to navigate a 2-foot-deep labyrinth. Most of that warmth essentially gave up and bounced right back into the room. The thermal mass provided by the clay and straw mixture also hoarded the daytime warmth, releasing it gradually as the sun went down. It felt quite like residing inside an enormous, insulated nest. The first few settlers who rode past realized there was no continuous trail of smoke rising from her roof. They stopped to investigate the matter. Jacob Brenner patted the outside plaster with a look of deep suspicion. "Exactly how much timber are you burning through each day, Mrs. Sorensen?" 3 or perhaps 4 small logs. Nothing beyond that." Jacob furrowed his brow. "That is impossible. I am going through 20 splits a day, and my place barely reaches a tolerable climate." "The thick walls are the real secret," Ingrid clarified. "The warmth simply doesn't leak out." "Straw," Jacob scoffed with utter disdain. "Once the true freezing weather hits, that filler will soak up moisture and rot away. And if a single field mouse chews a hole through it, your whole setup will collapse. The mud coating on the outside acts as a shield," Ingrid countered. "Plus, it is packed so tightly that not even a draft can push through." Jacob rode off, shaking his head. It wasn't because he had scientific doubts. It was because admitting a foreign widow had engineered something far superior to his 2 decades of frontier experience was a pill his ego simply couldn't swallow. November rolled in, carrying the first bitter waves of cold. Nighttime temperatures plummeted to nearly 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The daytime highs struggled to even breach the freezing point of 32 degrees. The homesteads across the county launched into their yearly war against the punishing Dakota winter. Over at Thomas Whitmore's grand estate, the hired help was forced to stoke 3 separate fireplaces around the clock. Their wood consumption was absolutely ravenous. 50 logs a day, possibly more. Yet the warmth kept rushing right up the flues and vanishing into the sky. Those sprawling windows, which looked so majestic during the summer, proved to be ruthless thieves of heat in the wintertime. Icy drafts whistled relentlessly through the gaps in the floorboards. Thomas dispatched riders to purchase additional blankets, heavy woolens, animal pelts. Even so, when morning came, the water resting in his bedroom wash basins was crowned with a solid crust of ice. At Jacob Brenner's cabin, the circumstances were slightly better, though hardly ideal. His sturdy log walls managed to retain a fair bit of warmth, yet his high ceilings worked completely against him. The heated air rose to the rafters and stayed trapped up there. The floorboards remained downright freezing. His wife and children slept fully clothed. They kept their heavy boots and thick coats on in bed. The cordwood pile was vanishing rapidly, alarmingly fast, and attempting to source more timber in the dead of winter was both costly and perilous. Samuel Perkins was dealing with the most severe crisis of them all. His sprawling house, built specifically to accommodate large gatherings, was utterly impossible to heat evenly. The drafts were continuous and brutal. The main chimney had a strong draft, but that simply meant it was actively sucking the warm indoor air straight out into the blizzard. His wife soon developed a stubborn, hacking cough. The ash and smoke that frequently blew back down the flue due to shifting winds only made matters worse. Meanwhile, over in Ingrid's straw bale shelter, daily existence painted a vastly different picture. Every single dawn, she roused from sleep without facing the shocking bite of the freezing air. The indoor climate rarely dipped below 54 degrees Fahrenheit, even while the exterior world turned to solid ice. She would kindle a modest flame, barely enough to prepare her morning meal. And that meager output of warmth was perfectly adequate to push the room's temperature right up to a comfortable 65 or 68 degrees. There were absolutely no icy breezes. Her miniature windows were incredibly simple to caulk. The low-hanging doorway, despite being a bit cumbersome, severely limited the amount of heat lost whenever she stepped outside, and those massive walls performed their duty silently and flawlessly. Ingrid was spending mere pennies on kindling, while her prideful neighbors were burning through dollars. One gloomy afternoon in December, as the prairie winds howled with exceptional fury, Samuel Perkins decided to pay her a call, an official visit, he claimed, solely to check on the well-being of a solitary widow. In truth, raw curiosity was eating him alive. How on earth was it possible that this laughable shack wasn't spewing thick columns of black smoke like every other home in the territory? Ingrid welcomed him inside and offered a steaming cup of tea. Samuel ducked his head to pass through the short frame and instantly noticed something peculiar. Warmth. Genuine, comforting warmth. He quickly scanned the room, searching for the stove. It sat in the corner, quite small, but there were no flames roaring inside it. Only a few fading embers remained. "How long ago did you let that fire die out?" he inquired suspiciously. "Earlier this morning. Roughly 6 hours ago." Samuel pressed his palm against the interior plaster. It felt pleasantly warm. Not burning hot, just pleasantly warm. It was as if the very structure was slowly exhaling heat. He was forced to shed his heavy overcoat because he was starting to sweat. "This simply ain't natural," he muttered under his breath. "It is the most natural thing in the world," Ingrid corrected him. "It is exactly how the earth itself teaches us to survive. The dead air captured inside the straw stalks is the finest insulation that exists, better than heavy timber, superior to solid stone. Samuel took a seat. He sipped his hot beverage in complete silence. His stubborn mind was wrestling a bitter war between undeniable evidence and his own deep-seated pride. Eventually, he spoke up. But the good book clearly states that a wise man builds his house upon the rock. And I chose to build mine out of what the Lord provided in absolute abundance. Ingrid shot back. The very straw that other folks foolishly cast aside. Samuel drained his teacup and saw himself out. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He refused to admit he was wrong. But the moment he stepped back into his own freezing parlor, he glared at his expensive wooden walls with a feeling that dangerously resembled pure resentment. December faded into January, and the January of 1881 would go down in history as the month hell itself froze over. Blizzard after blizzard battered the plains. Drifts piled upon drifts in a relentless white onslaught. The northern gales blasted with such ferocity that they flattened fences and tore poorly fastened roofs right off their rafters. Temperatures plummeted to depths those European settlers had never before endured. 40 degrees below zero. 45. On the bleakest nights, the mercury bottomed out at a bone-chilling 54 degrees below zero. At those extremes, the very fabric of the world changes. A person's breath instantly crystallizes in the air, drifting to the floor like diamond dust. Solid lumber turns as brittle as window glass. Iron nails pop loose as the metal violently contracts. And the livestock, those pitiful beasts that carried a family's entire financial future, perish right where they stand. Freezing so rapidly they turn into macabre statues on the prairie. Homesteads across the county transformed into desperate battlegrounds. Families chucked anything they could into the flames. Furniture, bound books, floorboards ripped straight from the parlor. The sheer desperation for warmth completely devoured all common sense. Over at the Whitmore estate, the circumstances were absolutely dire. They had blown through their entire winter reserve of cordwood by the first week of the month. He was forced to send farmhands out to forage for more, risking their very lives in the blinding whiteout. 2 of his laborers suffered devastating frostbite. One fellow lost 3 toes. The other had to surrender an ear. Those gorgeous brick hearths developed severe fractures from the violent shifts in temperature. Thick soot began seeping into the living quarters. Thomas's kin woke up every single dawn hacking their lungs out. His wife broke down in tears. She begged him to pack up and head back east. Anywhere to escape this frozen nightmare. Jacob Brenner was staring down his own personal catastrophe. One evening, a rogue draft knocked an oil lantern right over. The flames caught with terrifying speed. By some miracle, they managed to smother the blaze, though not before it scorched half an interior wall. Now they were left with a gaping hole that let the freezing gales slice in like a butcher's blade. They stuffed the breach with heavy quilts and clumsily nailed planks over it. Yet nothing truly kept the chill out. Jacob toiled day and night just to keep the embers glowing. His palms were bloody from endlessly splitting logs. His spine bowed under the crushing weight of sheer exhaustion. Samuel Perkins watched his darkest nightmare become reality. His youngest girl, 7-year-old Maria, came down with a severe case of pneumonia. Her coughing grew deep, heavy with fluid. The child was burning up with a vicious fever, yet she shivered violently from the drafts. There wasn't a physician to be found. The trails were entirely choked by snowdrifts. Samuel dropped to his knees in prayer until his legs went completely numb. But his desperate pleas to the Almighty did absolutely nothing to heat the parlor. Meanwhile, inside the straw bale shelter, the exact same structure everyone had written off as a fool's errand, Ingrid existed in an almost surreal state of peace. Naturally, she was fully aware of the horrors unfolding outdoors. She could hear the gale screaming. Through her tiny glass pane, she watched the relentless snow bury the frontier. Yet, safely tucked behind those massive barriers, her daily routine went on undisturbed. She would light a modest fire once a day, occasionally twice, and that proved to be plenty. The climate inside never sank below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the stove was going, it easily reached 70, maybe 72 degrees. A staggering difference of nearly 100 degrees compared to the lethal conditions beyond her door. She dined on fresh bread she had baked herself, steaming bowls of broth. She worked on her knitting. She read passages from her only copy of the good book, and every now and then, only occasionally, her thoughts drifted to her arrogant neighbors, leaving her with a feeling that sat somewhere between deep sorrow and quiet resignation. Then came the dreadful evening of January the 23rd. The blizzard reached its absolute peak. The squall didn't merely howl. It roared. It sounded like a living, starved predator. The whiteout was driving perfectly horizontal. You couldn't see a single inch past your own outstretched hand, and the mercury cratered to 44 degrees below zero. In conditions like that, a person lacking the proper gear will perish in a matter of minutes. Your lungs turn to ice. Your bloodstream turns to sludge. Your beating heart simply gives up the ghost. Back at the Whitmore residence, the roaring fireplaces could no longer keep up the fight. The chill forced its way through every tiny crack. Through the window sashes, beneath the door frames, Thomas corralled his entire household into a single room. They strung heavy quilts up against the drywall. They threw every combustible item they owned into the flames. But it still fell short. His eldest boy, just 19 years old, stared at him with sheer terror in his eyes. "Father, we are going to freeze to death in here." Thomas, the wealthy patriarch, the haughty gentleman who had glared down his nose at an impoverished widow, experienced an emotion he had never known in his life: absolute, unadulterated dread. And something even darker: the crushing certainty that his own stubborn vanity had just doomed his flesh and blood. In the Brenner cabin, the charred gap in the wall had morphed into a literal death sentence. The indoor climate had plunged below 14 degrees Fahrenheit. His youngest children had stopped crying. They merely trembled in total silence. That horrifying quietness that always signals the final stages of hypothermia. Jacob knew exactly what that meant. He had witnessed grown men freeze solid on the frontier. First comes the quiet, next comes the heavy drowsiness, and finally, nothing at all. Over at the Perkins homestead, little Maria was slipping away. Her breathing was shallow, frantic. Her complexion had taken on a sickly bluish hue. Her mother cradled the girl tightly against her chest, desperately trying to transfer her own body heat. But the woman herself was turning to ice. Samuel, the devout churchgoer, a man of unwavering faith, threw his hands toward the ceiling and hollered, "Lord, if you have forsaken us, just say it. But please do not take my little girl." It was his wife who snapped him out of his panic, the one who uttered the very sentence that would rescue their household. "Go to the widow's place. Head for that straw house. Swallow your pride and beg for her help." Samuel looked at his spouse as if she had proposed making a deal with the devil. "You want me to admit that crazy woman was right all along?" "Confess to whatever you must. Just save our daughter's life." And so it was, on the bleakest of nights, amid the most vicious blizzard, 3 highly prideful men attempted the impossible. Thomas Whitmore bundled his loved ones in every quilt they possessed. Jacob Brenner hoisted his youngest kids onto his shoulders. Samuel Perkins swaddled Maria tightly in thick buffalo hides, and all 3 parties began the agonizing trek toward the ridge where that peculiar dugout waited. It was anything but easy. The snowdrifts swallowed them up to their waists. The howling wind pummeled them like swinging hammers. Every single stride was pure agony. drawing breath felt like swallowing shattered glass. Yet the raw drive to survive easily overpowers human vanity. It is vastly stronger. Ingrid was sound asleep when she caught the sound of frantic pounding on her entryway. Desperate knocks. Faint, yet incredibly persistent. She rose from her cot, draped a thick woolen shawl over her shoulders, and unlatched the heavy wood. The sight that greeted her chilled her bones deeper than any winter squall ever could. 3 distinct households, upwards of 15 souls in total. Caked head to toe in white frost, quivering uncontrollably, sunken, haunted eyes, deep purple lips. Cradled in Samuel's grasp was a little girl who looked far closer to the grave than to the living world. Ingrid didn't utter a single syllable. There was absolutely no need for words. She merely stepped out of the way and hauled the door open as wide as the hinges allowed. "Get inside! Hurry!" The shivering crowd crammed themselves into the modest room. The earthen dwelling was certainly not engineered to hold this many folks. But that detail didn't matter one bit, because the exact second they crossed the threshold, their bodies registered a sensation they had completely forgotten. Warmth. It wasn't a blistering, scorching heat. It lacked the fierce, violent intensity of a roaring, desperate hearth. It was a soothing, perfectly even, deeply comforting climate. Much like sinking into a mother's gentle embrace. The compressed straw bales, the very same barriers they had openly mocked, were radiating absolute tranquility. The temperature was rock steady, not a single draft. No choking soot, just pure thermal sanctuary. Thomas Whitmore collapsed onto his knees on the dirt floor. Not out of religious devotion, simply because his frozen legs refused to support his weight any longer. Jacob Brenner squeezed his eyes shut and allowed the tears to streak down his weathered cheeks. Samuel carefully laid Maria down near the modest blaze that Ingrid was already stoking back to life. For the next several hours, the Norwegian widow moved about the room like a quiet prairie healer. She brewed pots of boiling tea. She spooned warm broth into the youngsters. She carefully inspected their extremities, hunting for any signs of dead tissue. And as she went about her duties, the proud men watched her in utterly humbled silence. Thomas finally broke the quiet. His voice was no more than a raspy whisper. "Mrs. Sorensen, I have been an absolute fool. A vain, arrogant fool." Ingrid didn't reply straight away. She just kept ladling out the stew. After a lengthy pause, she finally spoke. "Vanity has a way of blinding every last one of us at some point down the road, Mr. Whitmore. The only thing that matters is whether we choose to learn our lesson." Jacob Brenner stared long and hard at the walls. He ran his hand over the plaster with profound reverence. How can this be? How does this ordinary farm refuse accomplish what 20 years of carpentry failed to do? "Because the natural world holds far more wisdom than any of us," Ingrid replied softly. "My grandfather always preached that a man who chooses to wage war against the seasons will always be defeated. However, the pioneer who learns from it, who watches how the wild creatures weave their nests, who lets the prairie itself guide his hand, that is the man who survives." Samuel Perkins sat holding Maria, whose chest was now rising and falling with a much steadier rhythm. The unyielding, radiant warmth was actively pulling her back from the brink of death. He looked across at Ingrid, his expression carrying a weight he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine, absolute humility. "The Lord spoke directly through your actions, ma'am, and I was far too righteous to listen to the message." "The good Lord speaks through many different vessels," Ingrid noted gently. "Through the very harvest stalks we toss aside. Through the quiet wisdom of the old folks we choose to ignore. Through the advice we dismiss simply because it comes from the mouths of people we view as beneath our station." That brutal evening, 17 souls found rest inside a dugout engineered for a single occupant. It was certainly not a spacious arrangement, yet they were toasty. They were thoroughly protected, and by the time morning broke, as the sun finally pierced the heavy overcast and the blizzard began to run out of steam, they emerged from that earthen door as entirely changed human beings. Out on the prairie, the landscape resembled a frozen nightmare. The herds were entirely wiped out. Fence lines were completely obliterated. A good number of the homesteads had sustained crippling structural damage. However, the settlers had kept their lives, and that, they finally understood, was the only thing that held any real value. In the ensuing days, as Lawrence County caught its collective breath and tallied up the devastation, something truly remarkable started to unfold. Thomas Whitmore, the wealthy landowner, hired a crew to tear down entire sections of his grand estate, ordering them to frame double-thick walls packed tightly with straw. Jacob Brenner spent weeks sitting with Ingrid, absorbing every minute detail of her construction methods. He scribbled furiously in his ledger. He asked relentless questions. He finally allowed his years of hard-won experience to merge seamlessly with her ancestral knowledge. Samuel Perkins called for a special gathering at the local meeting house. Only this time, he wasn't there to lead a prayer. He was there to educate. He invited the Norwegian widow up to the pulpit. And standing before a congregation of 50 rugged pioneers, she laid out the straightforward physics that made her miraculous dwelling work. "It is not witchcraft," she explained, her thick accent echoing through the rafters. "It is simple physics. Stagnant air does a terrible job of moving heat around. Dried stalks capture millions of tiny air pockets inside the walls. Because of that, your hearth's warmth struggles to find a way out into the cold. A 2-foot barrier of densely packed bales acts just like wrapping your parlor in 100 heavy wool blankets. Plus, the material doesn't cost a dime. It's everywhere. And the fields grow a fresh batch every single autumn." The townsfolk absorbed her words with the fierce concentration of people who had just stared the Grim Reaper right in the eye. There was absolutely no snickering, no patronizing scoffs, only profound, unshakable respect. Over the following decades, Ingrid's building philosophy became the gold standard across that stretch of the Dakota frontier. Not every single residence was raised entirely out of bales, yet nearly all of them integrated some method of thick insulation relying on plentiful, natural resources: straw, dried prairie grass, or even heavy sawdust. The freezing seasons remained as punishing as ever, but they stopped being a guaranteed death sentence. Thomas Whitmore never fully managed to rebuild his vast wealth. The heavy costs of remodeling his estate and replacing his frozen herds dealt his bank account a severe blow. Yet he lived long enough to watch his grandchildren grow up safe inside a comfortably heated parlor, and whenever he recounted the horrors of that January freeze, he invariably capped off his tale with the exact same phrase: "An impoverished widow rescued every last one of us because she possessed the humility to heed the voices of her ancestors. Meanwhile, the rest of us, blinded by our deep pockets and inflated egos, nearly dragged our own families into early graves." Jacob Brenner eventually became the most vocal champion of the straw bale method. He rode out to neighboring settlements. He hosted free building workshops. He drafted easy-to-read construction guides filled with precise sketches. And he made absolutely sure to assign credit where it was due. "None of this is my invention. It belongs to Mrs. Sorensen. I merely had the great honor of becoming her student." Samuel Perkins got the chance to watch his little girl Maria grow into a woman, marry a good man, and raise babies of her own. Every winter, the very moment the first flakes began to drift from the sky, he would trek out to Ingrid's headstone to lay down a fresh wreath. Because Ingrid Sorensen peacefully passed away in 1893, at the ripe old age of 73, inside her beloved earthen dwelling, asleep in her cot, completely enveloped in warmth. Well over 200 settlers turned up to pay their respects at her burial service. Folks who had embraced her architectural wisdom. Parents whose children were still drawing breath entirely because of her foresight. Neighbors who had finally realized that modesty and a keen eye for nature are worth far more than all the gold buried in the Black Hills. Her grave marker bears a remarkably straightforward epitaph. It was a phrase she had personally picked out years prior. Here rests Ingrid Sorensen. She listened to the elders. She studied the earth. She ignored the sneers of the proud. And she rescued souls using nothing but field straw and humility. This narrative is grounded in absolute truth. The specific names might shift depending on who is spinning the yarn across the plains. But the core message remains firmly intact. Out in the American West during the late 19th century, when existence was savage and the winter storms showed zero mercy, it was the humble folks who managed to endure. Not simply because they possessed thicker wallets, not because they wielded heavier political influence. Rather, it was because they held the wisdom to truly listen, to watch the world around them, to draw vital lessons from the generations that had walked the trail before them. The very next time someone scoffs at your straightforward approach, at your unpretentious fix, or at the old-fashioned knowledge you've inherited, let your mind drift back to Ingrid. Keep in mind that the very same structure the whole town branded as garbage ended up saving lives right when the lavish estates collapsed under the pressure. Never forget that ancestral heritage, the kind of traditional know-how that modern society loves to ridicule, harbors deep truths that expensive modern tools frequently overlook. And remember well that a genuinely wise pioneer is never the one who frames the biggest or the priciest homestead. It is the person who erects a shelter that ensures their family survives to see the spring thaw. A place where their children wake up feeling safe and warm. Where a cozy hearth isn't purchased with heavy stacks of cash, but is instead forged through understanding, deep patience, and a profound respect for the lessons the soil so freely offers. Historical accounts like Ingrid's serve to remind us that modesty and attentiveness are infinitely more valuable than a gold rush claim, that the lived experiences of our grandfathers and grandmothers, those tough pioneers who weathered brutal hardships with next to nothing, represent a treasure chest far richer than any bank vault. If this tale of ultimate vindication struck a chord in your chest, if it proved to you that there is indeed an alternative path, a route where the underdog triumphs not through sheer force, but via cleverness, then make sure to pass it along. Share it with a friend who desperately needs a reminder that the almighty dollar doesn't solve every problem. That holding deep respect for our elders serves a highly practical purpose. That the most uncomplicated answers are frequently the most resilient ones we have. Because in a society that constantly prizes luxury over pure utility, the brand new over the battle-tested, and arrogance over humility, repeating these frontier tales is an act of sheer rebellion. They act as stubborn reminders that our forebears were anything but fools. They were master survivors. And if we intend to survive the harsh winters of our own modern era, we would be incredibly wise to tune into those old voices that history so frequently attempts to silence. Ingrid's earthen dugout is no longer standing today. The relentless march of time and the harsh prairie elements ultimately reclaimed those densely packed stalks. But her underlying legacy absolutely endures. It survives in the sustainable framing methods we are currently unearthing and parading around as if they were brand new inventions. It breathes inside the straw bale residences that contemporary architects sketch out with deep admiration. It lives on in every single individual who realizes that leading a straightforward, sensible life carries far more dignity than living in an expensive yet incredibly fragile glass house. And on those bitterly cold winter evenings, right as the gale shrieks exactly as it did back in January of 1881, some locals swear that if you strain your ears, you can catch the faint whisper of an old Norwegian pioneer woman. A ghostly voice speaking in a gentle yet unyielding tone. The trick isn't simply burning more logs. The real trick is ensuring the warmth never escapes. And the greatest trick of all is choosing to listen to the very folks your own pride begs you to dismiss. So let it be. Let us learn from it. Let us hold it in our memories. And let us forever honor those humble souls who managed to save us when the high and mighty had nothing to offer but freezing ashes.